All right, guys, we're going to continue our discussion or start a new discussion on the Vietnam War today. And this video, we're going to talk about the beginnings of the war and how it develops. And we're also going to discuss early support for the war and how that begins to fade. So today we're going to be talking about the concern of the spread of communism, the domino theory, and how that gets the United States involved in Vietnam. We're talking about Southeast Asia's colonial history, policies of Truman and Eisenhower, and also the conditions causing the conflict between North and South Vietnam. All right, so France had gained control of Vietnam by the late 1800s, and the Vietnamese were obviously opposed to this control for its entire history. This anti-French movement was led by a Vietnamese nationalist by the name of Ho Chi Minh. And so during World War II, the Japanese had actually conquered French Indochina, so the French had been pushed out. So Ho Chi Minh led a group called the Viet Minh to fight against the Japanese. And after World War II, the Viet Minh believed obviously that it would be declared that Vietnam would be declared independent. They helped push out the Japanese, but the French very quickly moved back in to reclaim Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, whose real name is Nguyen That Thanh, which is his actual given name, he takes the name Ho Chi Minh, which in Vietnamese means he who is enlightened. But they began by participating in tax revolts, refusing to pay taxes, violently revolting against French tax collectors and things of that nature. Ho joins the Communist Party in Vietnam and begins to believe that a communist revolution is a way that they could free themselves from their French oppressors. Again, World War II, Japan occupied French Indochina, which included Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh organized the Viet Minh to fight against them. After Japan surrendered in 1945, the Viet Minh declared Vietnam an independent nation. What happens, though, is the French, again, they move in and return to their colonial control of Vietnam. Now, Truman and Eisenhower are going to basically support the French for the most part because they were afraid that Ho would bring communist government to Vietnam. So they saw Vietnam, or Truman specifically saw Vietnam as a Cold War struggle. Communists had seized China in 1949. Communist North Korea had invaded South Korea in 1950, and you also had communist-led revolts throughout Southeast Asia and Indonesia, Malaya, and the Philippines. So, Truman and later Eisenhower are really going to draw the line with Vietnam. And they start to trumpet what becomes known as the domino theory. And the domino theory is the belief that if Vietnam was allowed to fall to communism, the rest of Asia would too. That's right. So anyway, basically as a result, the Eisenhower administration began sending ammunition, supplies, and money to French forces in Vietnam. The domino theory, like we talked about, the belief that communism would spread to neighboring countries if Vietnam fell, was a popularly held belief amongst American foreign policy experts. So to avoid this, the U.S. supported the French during their war in Vietnam. By 1954, the United States was actually paying more than 75% of the cost of France's war, and still France continued to lose battle after battle. The Viet Minh used effective guerrilla techniques. And finally, the last stand of the French was at Dien Bien Phu, where French forces were hoping for a U.S. rescue, but Eisenhower still was not ready to commit American soldiers. French were defeated May 7, 1954, and withdraw. And basically, after 8 years and nearly 300,000 soldiers killed on both sides, the Viet Minh are victorious. And this is important because it becomes it is a pattern for how Ho Chi Minh will fight the Vietnam War against the United States. So after the French leave, the Geneva Conference was convened. And basically this was to work out a peace agreement. So Vietnam, according to the Geneva Accords, is temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, much like Korea at the 38th. Viet Minh forces control the north, and the French would withdraw from Vietnam. Of course, the South is going to be non-communist. The idea was for elections to be held in July 1956, 2 years later, and that would reunify the country under one government. However, the United States and the southern government, the government of South Vietnam, never supported the idea for elections because they were afraid that Ho Chi Minh would win the election and the communists would take power over a unified Vietnam. So the United States supports the South Vietnamese president Ngo Dinh Diem. And Diem was a corrupt and brutal dictator that really angered many South Vietnamese. And Ho is seen as kind of this more popular alternative. So by the 1950s, you have South Vietnamese people basically rebelling against Diem's rule. So by the late 50s, by 1960, you basically have a civil war going on in South Vietnam. And then Ho basically expands his effort to unify the North and South under one communist government. So again, Diem was the president of South Vietnam. Brutal, corrupt, and unpopular from the start. He also favored Catholics, which was a problem because Catholics were closely related to the old French colonial power. Diem canceled the election in 1956, and though Ho's leadership was just as totalitarian, just as repressive, he gave land to peasants. His land reform made him widely popular. So you have this civil war going on in South Vietnam. North Vietnam is supplying weapons to the South Vietnamese rebels, and the Viet Minh in South Vietnam form was called the National Liberation Front, and their military forces will be called the Viet Cong, and we'll hear that throughout our discussion of Vietnam. So the Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics and terrorist tactics. They assassinated South Vietnamese leaders, and in 1960, Ho Chi Minh actually sent the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, into the country to fight with the Viet Cong. Now this is going to bring the United States in. The U.S. starts by sending money and weapons. Eventually, Eisenhower is going to commit to send military advisors. When Kennedy becomes president, he also believes in the domino theory and starts to send more military advisors and the first special forces into Vietnam. Advisors were not supposed to take part in combat, but many did. It was common practice. And then Johnson, we'll talk about later, believes an expanded U.S. effort was the only way to prevent communist expansion, and he asked for the Tonkin Gulf resolution. So Diem was overthrown. He becomes more and more popular. He arrested and killed Buddhist protesters, and U.S. leaders basically say that they're going to withdraw support. He refused to change, and in 1963, November of 63, shortly before Kennedy's assassination, Diem is assassinated. Johnson becomes president after Kennedy's assassination, and basically after Johnson claims that a U.S. ship was fired upon by Vietnamese torpedo boats, he convinces Congress to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Now, whether or not this was a provoked attack or unprovoked attack is still something that's of some debate. So the U.S. begins to ramp up its presence in the region. So we're going to talk about the mobilization and all that kind of stuff. All right, so the first real major action is Operation Rolling Thunder. And Johnson thought he could bomb the North Vietnamese into submission. So it was a bombing campaign over North Vietnam, targeting army bases, airfields, also bridges, roads, and power plants. What they were trying to do really was knock out the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this flow of supplies from North Vietnam, from China and North Vietnam into South Vietnam. Some of the weapons that they use are new. You have Agent Orange, which is a defoliant that destroyed vegetation. You also had the use of napalm, which is jellied gasoline that would be used to create these huge fire bombs. And then, of course, the cluster bombs, which sprayed sharp metal fragments when they exploded and expanded the kill zone. The bombing didn't succeed, though, because the Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't a trail. It was organic. It moved. They would just change. And the Viet Cong would just repair the bridges. They had this vast network of underground bunkers that really just weren't affected by the bombings. So the ground war begins to commence more and more, and despite the fact that the United States continues to throw more and more troops, it's basically ineffective. The search and destroy missions that General Westmoreland strategized were not very effective. Ground troops would go in, they'd locate an enemy, and they'd call for airstrikes. And they would clear an area, but then as soon as American troops left, the Viet Cong would come right back in. So then they shifted to what they call pacification, this idea of winning the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese. So this involved construction projects and things like that, but it also involved moving people out of their villages when the Viet Cong were nearby. And people didn't like being moved, so winning the hearts and the minds really kind of backfired on American forces. And these forces faced a lot of challenges, which led to declining troop morale. Viet Cong would strike, and they knew the land, they knew the territory, and it was hard to get a handle on them. Also, the Vietnamese peasants, who seemed peaceful during the day, were often aiding the Viet Cong or were Viet Cong themselves. So that was a problem. It was difficult for Americans to tell the difference between the enemy and the friendlies. Also, the U.S. forces were inflicting enormous casualties on the communists, but the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army continued to be supplied by the Soviets and the Chinese, and more U.S. airstrikes and pacification programs led more people to join the Viet Cong. So it was kind of a cyclical thing, and the U.S. couldn't really get out of it. So more and more troops were serving, and by the end of it, more than 2.5 million Americans served in the Vietnam War. And these were different soldiers than that served in World War II and Korea. They were slightly younger, generally not as well educated, and while at the beginning most were professional soldiers, as the war drags on, the government comes to depend more and more on draftees. And this is a problem. 25% of draftees were excused for health reasons. 30% received deferments or postponements for college students. A higher percentage of soldiers were minorities, specifically African Americans. So it becomes a situation where draftees are mostly, working class kids who didn't have the access to college or other things of that nature. A lot of young people often refuse service by basically fleeing. They go to Canada or somewhere else. Most Americans in Vietnam were actually in non-combat positions, and as many as 10,000 American military women served, many of them as nurses and things of that nature. You also had civilian men and women working in the region as well. Originally, public opinion for the war was pretty positive, but this is the first TV war. Reporters and television crews go out with soldiers, and people see these firefights at home in their homes every night, and it starts to turn the tide. So you begin to have it split in between hawks and doves. Doves are people who oppose the war, and hawks are people who support the war. But both are critical of the war effort. Hawks believe we're not doing enough to win the war. Doves believe we're doing too much. So you have the beginnings of the anti-war movement that's focused on college campuses and led by organizations like Students for a Democratic Society. So these protesters make up a small percentage, but they're going to grow after '68. So you had doves opposing the war that said, it's not crucial to American national security. They're fighting against the wishes of the Vietnamese. They're draining resources from the Great Society. There's all these different arguments against it, and we'll talk more about that in the next video.